Well, folks, it's 2025 and Wizards of the Coast is starting off the new year with a resounding thud, just like they did in 2024 and 2023 before it. I, of course, am Bill Sylvie, aka the Dungeon Delver, and before we get into today's somewhat dim direction of Dungeons and Dragons, if you would please, if you haven't already, click the subscribe button and click the bell icon for notifications if you'd like updates on when we release videos just like this, or our live streams where we have guests, actual plays, all sorts of fun stuff here on the channel. It's super helpful with the algorithm. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now, in a video that I did exactly a year ago or thereabouts, Jeremy Crawford, who was over at Wizards of the Coast, talked about the quote-unquote inherent racism of half-elves and other half-species in Dungeons & Dragons, and we all pointed and laughed because everyone who has played D&D for any stretch of times knows that that is flat-out untrue. But of course, we didn't think they'd go this far, and yet here we are. However, at least some of the press is not buying what 6th edition is offering up. Certainly a lot of the gaming public isn't. And we're going to look today at a piece from actually the Telegraph. That's right. The British paper, the Telegraph, has an article about Dungeons & Dragons. So let's take a look at what they've got to say. Dungeons & Dragons heading to inclusive oblivion after removing racial differences. Wokery Row is fantasy tabletop game criticized for removing racial differences between its cast of orcs, elves, and dwarves. And this was written over there by Richard Oliphant, and I will link to this below so you guys can check this article out yourself. Dungeons & Dragons has been criticized for removing racial differences between its casts of orcs, elves, and dwarves. In the new rulebook for the fantasy tabletop game released in September 2024, orcs are no longer inherently strong, nor elves intrinsically brainy. Wizards of the Coast, WotC, the game's publisher, has also dropped a post-apocalypse setting that featured slavery as a part of its drive to make the game more inclusive. Players who are made uncomfortable by an event in the game can now shut it down at any moment. Announcing the change to its rules, which replace race with species, WotC said, "Race is a problematic term that has prejudiced links between real-world people and the fantasy people of D&D worlds." Ladies and gentlemen, elves and orcs aren't real. Just in case you were afraid of that, just in case you were wondering, they're not real. To start a game, players must choose their avatar from a range including halfling, human, gnome, and dragonborn, a humanoid species descended from dragons. Before the 2024 update, which of course I refer to as 6th edition, each class came with boosts to different attributes. The hardy hill dwarf enjoyed a +2 lift to constitution, something that can help them as they navigate the game's map of enemies and challenges. But under the new rules, the hill dwarf is not naturally tough and can instead come from one of two different backgrounds: Miner, which restores the +2 constitution, or Scholar, which adds +2 to intelligence. The shift follows an earlier reform of two classes, Orcs and Vistani, after criticism that they were drawn from negative racial stereotypes, so on and etc. Some dungeon masters, the referees who shape the game for its players, feel the reforms are detracting from the magic of the game. All the species are becoming humans with decorations, or as I call it, Forehead of the Week Club. One D&D veteran, David Kuehler, said to the New York Times, "The criticism intensified when WotC released a book, The Making of Original D&D, to celebrate the game's 50th anniversary. In the foreword, Dungeons & Dragons historian John Peterson notes a virtual catalog of insensitive and derogatory language in the original 1974 game, which isn't there, but Mr. Peterson has his opinion, and the ear and checkbook of Wizards of the Coast. including words that are casually hurtful to anyone with a physical or mental disability or who happens to be old, fat, not conventionally attractive, indigenous, black, or a woman. I dare them. I dare him or anyone who buys that line of crap that Peterson was selling to point to racial slurs in original D&D. But that's another rant altogether. Let's continue reading the article. He added, "It's an unfortunate fact that women seldom appeared in the original D&D, and when they do, they're usually portrayed disrespectfully. That's a lie. Slavery appears in the original D&D not as a human tragedy that devastated generations over centuries, but as a commercial transaction." He also takes aim at cultural appropriation, including gods, demigods, and heroes range, writing, "Were players expected to fight Vishnu?" No. John Peterson fails Dungeons & Dragons 101. You get an F, John. Go sit at the back of the class with the dunce cap on. If that is the takeaway from reading gods, demigods, and heroes, or deities and demigods, then you get a big fat F. Critics argued that the foreword unfairly smeared the name. Critics argued that the foreword unfairly smeared the game's creator, Gary Gygax, who died in 2008, as a misogynist and racist. Elon Musk urged Hasbro, which owns WotC, to burn in hell. He wrote on X, "Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to trashy Gary Gygax and the geniuses who created Dungeons & Dragons. What the F is wrong with Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast?" Robert Kuntz, the last surviving member of the team who created D&D with Gygax, called the publishers snakes. And that's a sentiment I happen to agree with. WotC earlier confirmed that they had hired inclusivity consultants for the making of original Dungeons & Dragons. In May 2024, game designer Jason Tondo said the consultants had helped identify language we would not use today in gaming. Thank you, Jason. For many of today's players, the row comes down not to race, but to the nature of the game. The restrictions inherent in the old races were what made the game challenging and created a sense of risk. One user wrote on the Reddit D&D forum, "Feels like everything is focus grouped into an inclusive oblivion. Races and classes in a fantasy make-believe role-playing game are gradually being reduced to aesthetics. The demonstrification of things like goblins and orcs is also a travesty. Not everything has to be a morally gray soup. Some things can just be inherently evil, and that's okay." Now, interestingly, Mr. Oliphant points out here, sales figures suggest the critics are in a minority. WotC executives told the New York Times the 2024 Player's Handbook is the fastest selling publication in the company's history. They also said sales were not what they expected they should be back when these books released. So which is it? Wizards of the Coast, which is it? Are you defending tearing down Gary and claiming that this is the bestest ever, or are your sales on shaky ground? Writing in Wargamer last week, critic Timothy Linward focused on the new definition of orc in the 2024 Player's Handbook. They are, quote, "a smiling family of nomads. They have children, elders, well-cared-for houses, and pet hawks. We're supposed to recognize them as us rather than other. But D&D is not a game about creating intercultural harmony in a multiracial community. The rules still center violence, exploration, acquisition, and growth through adventure. Making orcs more than mindless antagonists in a world requires henchmen and goons simply passes the buck to someone else, hobgoblins, bugbears, giants, or whatever." So I think I've kind of made my feelings clear on the subject. And clearly the folks over at the Telegraph, at the very least, are giving voice to those of us who aren't having it. Whether or not Mr. Oliphant agrees with this direction or not, or even plays D&D, I don't know. But at least it was interesting to see, not the New York Times come out and defend these pointless forehead of the week changes that turn races into nothing other than interesting t-shirts. As far as, well, you can't have a smart dwarf or a dumb elf or a brave halfling or what have you. Those of you out there, of course, who are like me, and you come from the old school end of the hobby, know full well that the stats you roll dictate what kind of character you're going to have. A little bit of a plus or minus, going from an 11 intelligence to a 12 intelligence because of a bonus given to an elf, or a constitution of 10 to 12 for the bonuses given to a dwarf, don't inherently change how you play the character. This is just more enshittification of something by a corporate brand, by people who don't really understand the product they have, and they haven't for decades, plural, decades. Hasbro hasn't. And it's been evidenced through every step. 4th edition, the initial removal of PDFs, D&D Essentials, everything past the core books of 5e, with the sole exception of going back and re-releasing 1st, 2nd, and 3rd edition core rule books and original D&D for the 40th year anniversary apology tour that they undertook. Hasbro, and by extension, Wizards of the Coast, don't get what made D&D great. That's my opinion, and that's my takeaway from this article, but I'd like to know what you guys think in the face of that. What do you think about the changes that have come to D&D? Do you inherently see anything wrong with having an elf who's maybe a little bit dimmer than even the dwarf in the party? Because I personally think it all comes down to how you play it. And guys, that is exactly how you should do it. So from now on, let's not listen to press releases out of Seattle. Let's pay more attention to what's going on our table. And if you get the 5e rule books, I would recommend just taking a Sharpie and coloring that section out. But until then, keep your Sharpies handy, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.